So today we're going to talk about digital asset management. But first, I'm Jason Barone. I'm a design engineer at Uber. I currently work on Uber.com and some of our underlying publishing platforms that power Uber.com. And we work on a lot of publishing tools and workflows that allow our publishers all over the world to publish content at scale. So today I want to talk a little bit about what goes into that, but specifically what goes into the digital asset management side of things. Now, although this shows photos, digital assets are a number of things. They can be videos, produced audio files, photos, SVGs. Virtually anything that you're going to use in your creative, in your content online, that's what we're calling digital assets in the context of this talk. So let me kick it off and sort of my definition of digital asset management. So everyone's going to have sort of a different outlook on what this workflow looks like. I kind of break it down into three separate pieces, which is the creative, which we just talked about. You know, the creative is anything that's built that's going to be used alongside of your content. Anything that happens before the creative is not really relevant to us in this talk. Obviously, hiring photographers or videographers or having someone illustrate stuff for you, that's a whole process in itself, and we just don't have time to cover that in this particular talk. However, the creative, assuming that you have a final piece of creative, that's where we're going to start. So that's the first part, and then obviously the second part, CMS or content management system. This is the method of how you manage your content, and then finally production, which is your production channels such as a website, an app, or some other place that you're distributing this content. So we're going to dive into each one of these, starting with creative. So this photo is just a photo I grabbed off of Trey Ratcliffe's website, but we start with a digital asset, a finished digital asset, and then we move that into a content management system. So the main thing to kind of pay attention to is we have a number of different creative elements that we want to get into a system of managing the content. Once we have creative, we need to get it somewhere where we can manage it and create structure around the content. So the second part I feel is the most important, which is how you manage this creative and how you add structure to creative. So the way to do that is a content management system. I actually pulled this illustration off of the Contentful.com's website, and that's the platform that I recommend and I use for content management. What you don't want to get into is a method of people basically managing content, managing digital assets on a Mac or in Photos, in the Photos app on a Mac. In Dropbox, Box.com. Typically what I see with a lot of companies is they're building their creative portfolio, or if they're doing content at scale, they're managing these photos in a folder on Mac. And then when you build a team and you're trying to actually publish this content, typically what I see is you'll have someone at the company share a link to a Dropbox and say, okay, here's all of our digital assets, but there's really no structure, there's no context whether we can use these images on public websites, whether there's legal sign-off for faces that are in these photos. So there's a lot of sort of nuances about the creative that is just not taken into consideration, mainly because asset management is done locally on a machine. So we need to move this into a content management system and add structure around the creative. So the way to do that is by structuring content. So one of my favorite applications on the web is Contentful, because they've basically built a system of building structured content online, and this is how it's supposed to be done in terms of structured content. So what does this mean in the context of an asset? So you talk a lot about structured content, but what does this actually look like? Well, let's go back to this creative photo. By itself, this is just a photo. Most people will throw this into a content management system like WordPress, like Contentful, or any other, like Squarespace, Medium. They'll throw assets in there without any real structure to it. So when I look at something like this, we need to start giving it metadata and structure. So first of all, we would add something like a title. So like where this photo was taken, or maybe it's a headline about this creative. That's the first piece of this. Then obviously we have something like a description. I know it's a little small. I'm not sure if you can actually see it on the screen there. But then you're going to add some text, a description of this image. You might add a URL slug. So if you're publishing this on a web channel or a website, and you want to create a unique piece of content or unique page around this piece of creative, it would be helpful to have some sort of a URL slug just for reference. Now we can create this automatically based on the title. There's a lot of things we can do here. I'm just mainly like throwing out pieces of data to show you the structure. Next, we want to give it something like categories. So this photo may be a landscape photo, maybe a travel photo, and we want to add these sort of higher level categories. That way we start creating a taxonomy to search this information. So if we have thousands of images, but they're not tagged, they're not categorized, how are we ever going to find these pieces of content, especially when we want to write a blog post or create a page of content or a new product? The second part, or the second piece of metadata, are the tags. So you can see here, like this photo, we can start tagging it with things like Asia, China, mountains, maybe the camera that it was shot on, like a Canon 5D. And once we have all this, we now have a metadata structure to the content. So the question would be, how do you actually do this, though? Most people would keep a pile of photos on their Mac, and then they would just organize things into folders. Maybe they'll use a tagging system built into Adobe Lightroom or Apple Photos. But really, if you're going to be publishing this content on the web, you want to get this content into some sort of a web database. That way you can use it. And if you have a website, you want to make sure your website can integrate with this content. Otherwise, you're just doing rework, duplicate work, and wasting a ton of time and resources. So the way I would do this is use something like Contentful, like I mentioned. And the reason is because Contentful is structured in a way where we can basically build out models of content or structures of content and get that information into a template or into some sort of a database or bucket where we can reference it. So this is just a quick diagram I pulled from Contentful's website, where basically they're just trying to show you how the system operates. If you get everything into Contentful's database, you can use their APIs to access it. So if we build a website or we build an application, we can just integrate directly with the content that's in Contentful. So the goal of this would be, let's build a digital asset management system powered by something like Contentful, and then if our website is also powered by Contentful, then our content's all in the same place, and we can reuse and not do duplicate work. So how would this look if we go back to this structure of this creative asset? So we have this metadata on the bottom here. How would we actually turn that into usable content on the web? So I would look at this as more like, what are these types of pieces of content? Like, what is a label that I could give this type of thing? And it's pretty straightforward. I mean, the image is going to be something like an image. We call it a title, a description, categories, tags. Really, you've already built the structure just in the very fact of planning this out. So the next thing we want to do is really just move this into a platform like Contentful. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to attempt a live demo. So hopefully the web gods keep the speed up here. So if you're not familiar with Contentful, this is just a really quick overview of the backend. When you log in to the backend, let me make sure my screen is adjusted okay here. So when you log into the backend, this is a completely default space or project. And basically, we can take our structure that we've planned out in terms of asset management and move that into a system like this. And it's actually super simple, and we can fly through this in actually just like a minute or two. So Contentful has a feature called Content Models, where you can build the structure of the content. And literally, I'm just going to refer back to the structure, the asset structure that we talked about here. We're going to do an image, title, description, and all these other fields. And it's actually really easy to do. So let's add a new content type. Let's actually call this asset. And then that easy, we've created it. Now we just have to add fields to the content. So what Contentful allows you to do is actually just structure input fields for a CMS so that your users, your team, anyone you work with can actually log in here and create that type of content. So if we need a title, let's just add a title field. I'll hit return, and that easy, we've added the structure for a title field. I'm just going to really quick add a few of these, but not all of them here. And we're going to have a image. So Contentful has all these different fields on the back end here. It's probably hard to see there, but I'll leave some links in the video that we can that you can check out later. But basically, these are field types. If you're in web development, you probably have understand what a field type is. But basically, we have different things like booleans, text fields. You can add a JSON object or a piece of media or reference other pieces of content in Contentful. So that's what we're going to do here for categories. We're going to reference categories, and I'll explain that in just a second here. Let me make sure I actually spell it right. So we're going to do many references because with a photo or a digital asset, we want to refer to multiple categories in some cases. So let me go ahead and create that one. Let's go ahead and do that one more time for tags. And we'll do many references. And then what else are we missing here? So we have a URL slug, and we should be good to go. So I'll add text. I'll call this URL slug, and field ID would be slug. Contentful also lets you do little validations. So here I want to make sure this is a unique field, and the appearance, and I know I'm skipping through some of this stuff, but I'm going to create a slug, and then I'm just going to drag the order around really quickly here. Let me make the image up there at the top. So I'm going to save, and once I save that, it actually creates a content type in Contentful. So if I jump over to the content tab here, and now if we add a piece of content, since I only have assets, that's the only option I have. And those fields are now in user editable input fields. So everything we just went through. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at some images that I already uploaded into the media bucket. So basically, Contentful allows you to upload images, but without structure, they're just images. So the whole point of this exercise was to show you how we can actually add structure to these images. So let me go ahead and really quickly just publish these, and I'll show you what this means here. Let's go in, and let's first link to an existing asset. So we're going to link to an image that's in our Contentful account, which I previously uploaded. Let's go ahead and add this park right here. So for this asset, we've now created an image, but let's start naming this. So let's say New York Central Park. And you can see automatically it's filling in the URL slug for us. It's just slugifying the title. For the description, I'm just going to add some, maybe some lorem ipsum or so. We'll get that in here. Let's go with that. So we'll keep that as the description. Now for categories, so this is where when you start structuring stuff for a digital asset management system, you want to make sure you're thoughtful about categories and tagging, because if you're building a web application that has lots of content, like thousands of pieces of content, having a good taxonomy or classification system for all the content is definitely recommended. So what I'll do here is I'll just create a few really basic categories. So let's create a, whoop, I didn't add the validation here, so let me show you how we do that. So let me publish as it is. And one other thing that I forgot to flip to was, so not only are we going to do a structure of asset, we're also going to create structure to the categories and tags. So one thing that's often missed when people build web applications and digital asset management systems is they don't add structure to the sort of overarching categories and tags. So if you have 1,000 images and you have them categorized into maybe 5 or so different categories, without having any metadata associated to the category, you really don't know what the category is. So this gives you an opportunity to actually structure your categories and tags, and then you can build web pages, or you can build, category pages on your blog, all based around this same metadata that's in the website. So let's just quickly add this structure here. We're going to pick a main image, which is actually just going to reference an asset, and then we have a title, description, and URL. Pretty straightforward. And the way to do that is we're just going to go in here, and we're going to create a new content type called categories. And again, same quick process here. We're going to create a title. And I know I'm flying through this, but it will make sense very shortly. And let's reference, we're going to reference our images by saying we're going to create and configure this, accept only assets. So these are some of the validation features that Contentful allows you to do when you're creating content types. So you can set validations on the fields. You can ensure that your users are only selecting certain things when they use some of these features. So we'll add an asset here for appearance. Let's do entry card. And I think that will probably be OK. So let's save that, and let's move that to the top. The last one that was missing was the slug. I'll just call it slug. And then we will validate that, or validate that with slugs. All right, so last thing here, let's just duplicate that and do the same exact thing for tags. So that way we don't have to recreate anything. We're going to use the same exact structure. And that is it. So what have we created now? So really we've only created one asset If I go back into there, now we can start creating and assigning categories and tags to our asset. So let's do that. I'll create a category here. And let's call this, maybe this category is like city photos. Might be a little generic, but let's go with it for now. So let's go with city photos. Publish. So we just assigned a category to that asset, and then let's add some tags. Because this is New York, we want to make sure we get that city name in there. So let's add a New York tag. We will publish that. Now, the reason I'm doing this, the first time you set up a digital asset management system, you're not going to have any of this data. So the tags are going to be stuff that you create yourself. But over time, once they're in the database, you're able to actually link to those very quickly, especially with a system like Contentful. So for instance, if I create another asset, I'm going to go with that now for tags. Let's just publish that. If I go back in and create another asset, first let me link the images up. I'm just going to grab that image we used in the presentation here. So let's just call this test image, because I actually don't know the city name. And then because we already have some categories and tags, instead of creating them, we can just link to them. So Contentful actually allows you to just link to existing things that are already in your database. So in this scenario here, you can see city photos, but city photos isn't correct for this particular photo, so we're going to have to create a new link, or a new category. So let's do that, and let's say landscapes. We're going to create a landscape category here, and go back. And then for tags, so this would be something where we create something like, let's do China. We'll do let's create Asia as well. And then we'll pull it all together, and we'll actually show you what this all means, as some of you might be confused as to what's actually going on here. So I just ran through a lot of that stuff very quickly and probably confused a lot of you. However, here's what we basically did. So let me delete this post. Created that accidentally. So we created two assets. Now, at the beginning of this talk, I talked about creating structure to your assets, or assigning metadata and assigning structure to an existing asset. So when you look at something like this, and we click New York Central Park in your database here, or in your CMS, this is an asset titled New York Central Park. So we would be able to use this in a blog post about New York, or we'd be able to use this asset in virtually anything on our application. So when our users go into our content management system here, depending on what else we're using Contentful for, like if we're just using it for digital management or asset management, that's okay as well. Contentful is a platform just to store content. However, if you power your website or your blog by the same platform, you're only going to just receive more benefits. This is going to allow you to just have content that you can reference. When you're building a blog post, you can just reference that content fairly easy. So when I click into this New York Central Park here, you can see there's my title, there's my description, my URL slug, and my categories and tags. Pretty straightforward. So if I go back, what does this all mean now that it's in here? Well, remember, what we've created inside of Contentful is essentially content types, and as we create content, we're creating a bucket of content. This allows us to do virtually anything to it. So if I click back in to my content model here for asset, there's the fields that we set up originally, and you'll notice this little tab here. It says JSON Preview, and if I click here, you can see you're basically just getting structured JSON for all the fields that you've created. And what this means is it basically allows you to programmatically get access to anything you put inside of Contentful. And that's what we've done here. So let me jump back into the presentation here. So where are we at, and what have we done so far with this short little demo? So we talked a little bit about the creative. So again, we're assuming that you have finalized creative, photo, video, whatever it may be, and then you're getting that into the CMS. So what we did as part of this demo is we used the Contentful platform to create a structure to our assets, and then we created a few pieces of content, a few tags, and a few categories. However, we did it all ourselves. So if we're the founder of a company, or we're doing everything at the company, that would be the way to do it. However, if you have a team, that's not going to work too well, especially when you start talking about getting into production. So now that we have that content in the CMS, The next part would be using that in a distribution channel such as your website, such as your iOS app or some sort of AR, VR application. You can do all of that by the very fact that it's powered by a platform that supports different APIs. However, the problem is we need to set up some sort of restriction because we don't want anyone just adding creative, adding photos into our CMS, and then having our writers or people that don't know the rules of our business creating content and just randomly publishing stuff. So one of the things I recommend is setting up gates between these three parts. So before creative hits the CMS, I think it needs to be, for one, legally approved. That involves licensing, whether these are stock photos that you're purchasing, whether they're photos that you took with a photographer. There's all sorts of little nuances that you have to take into consideration before you can just assume you use something on the web. So the way to do that is to set up some sort of a gate or method of verifying and reviewing all photos before they go into your CMS. I recommend that you work with visual designers, content people, and obviously like legal teams to do that. However, if you're a startup, you don't have access to all those resources. So that's where you can kind of lean on, maybe there's licensed or photos that you can buy the license for online. There's any number of things you can do. But the key thing is you don't want anyone just adding photos to your digital asset management library. There's all kinds of reasons you don't want that to happen. Being at a big company like Uber or Airbnb or Google, there's no way they would ever let random images just randomly make it into their content management system, because then writers and people who don't know what they're doing would just publish that onto the official Google blog or the official Airbnb listing for a specific city. So the way to do that, it's pretty straightforward. If you're using something like Contentful, which is the reason I rave about it all the time, it has an entire roles and permissions thing just built right into it. So you can see here, it's probably hard to read, but some of those line items here, I created this in my account. I created a digital asset manager role and permission, which means they're able to create digital assets of the asset type, but they're not allowed to do anything else in the platform. So if I have a massive application where we have, like, let's say dozens of different pieces of content types, and we have assets and then blog posts and maybe they're like product pages, we don't want the digital asset manager or a production designer going in and editing or creating any of that type of content. We want them to basically just manage assets and just approve those and get those into our CMS. Right below Digital Asset Manager, I have Editor, which that's someone who can actually create content. Someone at the company who has that particular role, they're able to create content using the assets from the asset manager. And what they're restricted at doing is creating their own assets, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like we're delegating specific roles to specific people at the company. Now, obviously, this depends on your company, because if you only have a certain amount of people, or if you don't have anyone, this is obviously going to change. But this is built for more of like a scalable system where you have a few people on the team that are actually building content for your product, whatever that may be, website, blog. And then finally, we have a publisher. Publisher, they're the person basically that has the access to publish and unpublished stuff. So I actually think editors and publishers should be separate, because those are the people that have like the final say and they're the decision makers. Because remember, if you're a big company and you publish something with unapproved content, it's just bad news. So going back to our original three-part piece here. So creative, and then going to the CMS, and then going into the production. So the production part is always the tricky one, because once you have that content in a content management system, the production part is totally up to you. I mean, it really, again, it depends on your business and what you're doing. So I don't want to make any like recommendations on like how to actually get this content out there or get it to a website. But going back to the Contentful diagram that I showed before, the reason that this platform is so good is because once it's in there, if you're using this for your digital asset management system and you're building structure and you're building your business around this platform, you can virtually build anything you want. So they have some examples here. It's probably hard to see, but like AR, VR applications, wearables, websites, all of that can pull content directly from Contentful because they have APIs to do it. So I don't want to jump into coding because I had to shorten this talk a little bit to get it on here. However, our next talk is actually going to go into some live coding with Contentful. So hopefully that made sense. Give it a try. Boom.